The heavy clang of the metal door vibrated through Alex's bones, a final, definitive period at the end of his old life. It wasn't just sound, it was a physical sensation, a blunt force trauma to his psyche. The air inside was different too, thick with the metallic tang of old iron, and something else, something undefinable but palpable. Despair, perhaps, or simply the absence of hope. He stood for a moment, letting his eyes adjust to the muted light that struggled to penetrate the high barred windows. The hallway stretched before him, an uninviting tunnel of gray stone, each block seemingly absorbing the light rather than reflecting it. "Move it, new fish," a gruff voice rumbled from behind him. Big Bertha, her frame as imposing as the door that had just sealed his fate, gestured with a flick of her wrist down the corridor. Her uniform, a crisp, starched blue, seemed to mock the grime and weariness that clung to Alex like a second skin. He didn't need to be told twice. He pushed off the wall, his duffel bag feeling heavier than usual. Each step a reluctant commitment to this new reality. The soles of his worn boots scuffed against the polished concrete, the sound echoing unnervingly in the oppressive silence. Every few paces, a low, guttural murmur would seep from behind a closed door, quickly swallowed by the cavernous space. His gaze flickered, taking in the details. Cracks snaked across the ceiling, like old scars on a forgotten face. The occasional bare bulb cast a sickly yellow glow, illuminating dust motes dancing in the stagnant air. Graffiti, crudely scratched into the stone in places where paint had chipped away, offered glimpses into the lives of those who had passed this way before him. Names, dates, desperate symbols. He didn't try to decipher them. He just observed, his mind a silent, efficient processing unit. This wasn't a place for sentimentality. It was a place for survival. Bertha led him to a small, unassuming door near the end of the hall. She unclipped a ring of keys from her belt, the jingle a jarring counterpoint to the pervasive quiet. The lock clicked, a sharp, metallic sound, and the door swung inward with a groan. "This is you, Miller," she announced, her voice devoid of inflection. "Lights out at 10. No funny business. You got a problem, you come to me. Otherwise, keep your head down and your mouth shut, understand?" Alex simply nodded, his eyes already sweeping the interior of his new cell. It was exactly as he'd imagined. Stark, utilitarian, and suffocatingly small. A narrow cot with a thin mattress occupied one wall, a stainless steel toilet and sink another. A single, small window, high and barred, offered a sliver of the outside world. A sliver of concrete wall and a sliver of perpetually overcast sky. He stepped inside, the door clicking shut behind him with a dull thud. This time, it wasn't a final period, but an ellipsis, a pause before the next unknown sentence. He dropped his duffel bag beside the cot, the meager contents rattling softly. The air in the room was colder than in the hallway, carrying a faint institutional smell of disinfectant and something else. A stale, unidentifiable odor that clung to the walls. He ran a hand over the rough blanket, on the cot, its texture like worn sandpaper. He sat on the edge of the bed, the springs groaning in protest. He didn't unpack, not yet. Instead, he just sat, letting his senses absorb the new environment. The silence was not truly silent. It was a tapestry woven from distant shouts, the scrape of shoes on concrete, the intermittent dripping of water, and the low hum of fluorescent lights somewhere far away. He could almost feel the weight of the building pressing in on him, a monolithic structure designed to contain, to isolate. Through the thin wall, he heard a muffled cough, then the low murmur of voices. He couldn't make out the words, but the cadence spoke of resignation, of long hours spent in close proximity. He closed his eyes for a moment, picturing the faces of the men he'd passed in the hallway. Gaunt, haunted eyes, shoulders slumped under an invisible burden. They were all shadows in this place, moving through a perpetual twilight. He opened his eyes, taking a slow, deep breath, trying to dispel the knot that had formed in his stomach. He wasn't afraid, not precisely. Fear was a luxury he couldn't afford. It was a cold, calculated assessment of his new reality. He was a survivor, a ghost in the shadows, and he would adapt. He always had. This wasn't the battlefield he was used to, but the tactics remained the same. Observe, analyze, plan. He noticed a small indentation on the wall beside his cot, a tiny, almost imperceptible scratch. Someone else had been here, had sat on the same cot, had looked out at the same sliver of sky. He wondered about them, about their stories, about how they had navigated this cold, unforgiving landscape. He knew his own story had just taken an unexpected turn, a detour into the heart of darkness, but even in the dark, there were always shadows, and shadows could hide a great deal. They could hide strength, resilience, and the quiet resolve of a man determined to endure. He just had to find his place among them. Quiet eyes and loud men. The clang of a distant bell, sharp and insistent, tore Alex from his contemplation. It was a summons to the mess hall, the first communal gathering of his new existence. He fell in line with the shuffling column of men, the air thick with the smell of unwashed bodies and something vaguely metallic. The dining hall was a cavernous space, its high ceiling amplifying the cacophony of scraping chairs, clattering trays, and the low rumble of hundreds of voices. Fluorescent lights, harsh and unyielding, cast a pallid glow on the faces around him, etching deep lines into weary countenances. He took a tray, a meager portion of lumpy gray gruel, and a slice of dry bread, then navigated the crowded tables, searching for an empty seat. Every glance felt like an assessment, every murmur a potential judgment. He kept his gaze neutral, his movements deliberate, a phantom in the periphery. Finally, he found a spot at the end of a long table, tucked against the wall, offering a decent vantage point without inviting direct interaction. From his quiet corner, Alex began his silent inventory. The men were a study in contrasts. Some hunched over their food, devouring it with animalistic hunger. Others sat with an air of defeated resignation, pushing their trays around without interest. There were the loud ones, their laughter booming, their conversations peppered with crude jokes and threats. And then there were the quiet ones, like himself, observing, calculating, their eyes holding secrets and sorrows. His attention snagged on a figure across the hall. He was impossible to miss. Brutus the Hammer. Thorn, as Alex had already heard whispered, was a man carved from granite. His shoulders seemed to stretch the fabric of his uniform to its breaking point, and his neck was a thick, corded column. A network of crude tattoos snaked up his forearms, disappearing into the sleeves of his shirt. His face was a bulldog's, jowly and perpetually scowling, with small piggy eyes that darted across the room, seeking out potential challengers or new victims. He ate with a primal ferocity, tearing at his bread, his movements radiating an almost palpable aggression. Other inmates gave him a wide berth, their gazes deferential, their conversations lowering to hushed tones as he passed. Brutus was a force, an apex predator, in this concrete jungle, and Alex decided then and there to be nothing more than a shadow in his domain. The meal was tasteless, but Alex ate it all, a disciplined act born of necessity. Waste was not an option here. He cleaned his tray meticulously, then returned it to the rattling cart, avoiding eye contact with the hulking guards who monitored the flow of inmates. Later, during the designated yard time, Alex sought refuge from the oppressive proximity of others. The yard was a rectangular patch of cracked asphalt, enclosed by high walls topped with razor wire. A few rusted basketball hoops stood neglected, their nets long gone. Groups of men clustered together, talking, playing cards, or simply pacing like caged animals. The air was colder here, carrying the faint metallic tang of the city beyond the walls. He found a secluded corner near the far wall, partially shaded by the meager overhang of a guard tower. It wasn't much, but it offered a sliver of peace. He pulled the worn copy of Moby Dick from his uniform pocket, its spine softened by countless readings, its pages thin from handling. He had smuggled it in, a small act of defiance against the institution's attempt to strip him of everything familiar. Opening the book, he began to read, letting the rhythmic prose wash over him, a temporary escape to the vast, indifferent ocean. He held the book close, his body language a clear signal. I am here, but I am not present. I am reading, not engaging. He hoped to blend into the background, to become as unremarkable as a loose pebble on the yard's surface. He felt the weight of unseen eyes, the occasional curious glance, but no one approached. For now, his strategy of quiet observation and deliberate anonymity seemed to be working. The sun, a pale disk in the gray sky, offered little warmth, but Alex found a different kind of solace in the familiar weight of the book. The whisper of turning pages, and the temporary reprieve from the loud, aggressive world that surrounded him. He was a speck of dust in a storm, waiting for the winds to die down. Old Man Jones, a gaunt figure whose presence Alex had barely registered in the mess hall, sat on a bench a few yards away, whittling a piece of wood into an indistinguishable shape. His eyes, the color of faded denim, watched Alex over the rim of his spectacles, not with malice, but with a quiet, assessing curiosity. Alex felt the old man's gaze, but didn't acknowledge it, keeping his focus on the Melville. He was content to be the quiet observer for now. The bully's shadow. The clank of metal trays against steel counters usually heralded a brief reprieve, a momentary distraction from the gnawing monotony. But in the cafeteria, Brutus Thorn ensured it was always accompanied by a different kind of clang, the heavy thud of his presence. Today, it was a smaller, older man, already stooped by prison life, who felt the brunt of it. Brutus, a hulking mass of muscle and menace, simply shoved him aside, a dismissive grunt the only apology. The man's tray, meager as it was, clattered to the floor, gravy spreading like a dark stain. Brutus scooped up the man's untouched portion of mystery meat and a stale roll, adding it to his own already overflowing plate, without a backward glance. A collective sigh, almost imperceptible, rippled through the line. No one spoke. No one met the old man's downcast eyes. Alex, further back in the queue, saw it all. He saw the flicker of fear in the old man's gaze, the way his shoulders slumped even further. It wasn't a display of strength, Alex thought, but a naked exhibition of insecurity, masked by brute force. He kept his own expression neutral, his focus seemingly on the chipped paint of the wall in front of him. Later, in the yard, the thin winter sun offered little warmth. The recreation space was a cacophony of shouts, the thud of basketballs, and the low hum of hushed conversations. Brutus, however, found a new target for his boisterous aggression. A quiet, unassuming man, new to their block, had unknowingly chosen a concrete bench near the basketball court. Brutus's spot, according to the unspoken rules of the yard. Brutus's roar cut through the general din, a primal sound that silenced nearby chatter. "Get out of my damn seat, worm!" he bellowed, his voice laced with unbridled fury. The man, startled, scrambled to his feet, a book falling from his lap. Brutus kicked it away, a worn paperback that skittered across the rough concrete. "That's my spot, you hear me? Mine!" The veins in Brutus's neck pulsed. The man, pale and trembling, simply nodded, retreating quickly, slick Mike, leaning against the fence nearby, a knowing smirk playing on his lips, caught Alex's eye. Alex offered no reaction, his gaze already drifting to the chipped paint on the basketball hoop. The next few days saw Brutus's shadow lengthen across the yard. He wasn't always directly confrontational, but his presence was a heavy weight. He'd stand in the middle of a card game, arms crossed until the players awkwardly folded their hands. He'd loudly critique a struggling weightlifter, forcing the man to drop his weights in embarrassment. The air crackled with a low, constant tension. Alex, meanwhile, continued his deliberate anonymity. He walked the perimeter of the yard, his head down, hands tucked into his pockets. He always found a secluded corner to read, the familiar weight of Moby Dick, a comfort in the disquiet. He observed, he listened, he learned. He noticed the routes people took, the unspoken rules, the subtle shifts in alliances, and he noticed Brutus's patterns. Brutus favored a direct path from the cell block to the yard, cutting diagonally across the open space, like a shark patrolling its territory. Alex, with a calculated shift in his routine, began taking a longer, less direct route. He'd wait for the initial rush of inmates to clear, then walk along the far wall, past the laundry room entrance, and around the back of the gym building. It added a few minutes to his journey, but it ensured he didn't cross paths with Thorn. It wasn't cowardice, Alex knew. It was strategy. He wasn't here to make waves, not yet. He was here to survive, to observe, to understand. The prison was a complex ecosystem, and Brutus was its apex predator. For now, Alex was a shadow, moving in the periphery, charting the currents, waiting for the opportune moment to reveal himself. The sun, when it broke through the perpetual gray of the prison's sky, felt like a spotlight, and Alex preferred the shadows. A sunny afternoon standoff. The recreation yard buzzed with a dull hum of discontent, a constant low thrum beneath the forced laughter and sharp whispers. Dust motes danced in the sparse sunlight, filtering through the high wire mesh, illuminating patches of cracked concrete. Alex, however, had found his own quiet corner. Nestled against the cool, rough wall of the shower block, a sliver of warmth had staked its claim, a defiant golden rectangle in the otherwise drab expanse. Here he sat, legs stretched out, an old paperback held open in his hands. The words blurred occasionally as his gaze drifted, taking in the shifting dynamics of the yard, the furtive exchanges, the subtle hierarchies. He wasn't truly reading, not with the focused intensity of a scholar. Rather, the book served as a shield, a silent declaration of unavailability, while his mind processed the information flowing around him. The sun, a rare indulgence in this place, warmed his face, a fleeting comfort against the pervasive chill of his circumstances. A shadow fell over his page, thick and imposing, eclipsing the words and the sun alike. The air around him suddenly felt heavy, charged with an unwelcome presence. He didn't look up immediately, his eyes still scanning the lines, though he registered the change in light, the faint scent of unwashed denim and stale sweat. The pace was slow, deliberate. Each heavy footfall, a drumbeat against the concrete, announcing arrival, demanding attention. It was a walk designed to intimidate, to assert dominance before a word was even spoken. Alex knew that walk. He'd seen it countless times in the brief days he'd been confined here. Finally, he lifted his gaze, slowly, deliberately. Brutus Thorn stood over him, a hulking mass of muscle and menace, effectively blocking the sun from Alex's personal oasis. The man's face was a craggy landscape of old scars and raw ambition, a sneer twisting his lips. His small, piggy eyes, usually darting with suspicion, were now fixed on Alex with a predatory glint. "Well, well, well," Brutus rumbled, his voice a gravelly scrape. "Look what the cat dragged in. Didn't think you were one for the yard, pretty boy." The last two words were laced with a venomous derision that hung in the air, drawing a few curious glances from nearby inmates, who quickly averted their eyes, unwilling to become collateral damage. Alex remained calm, his expression unreadable. He closed his book, placing a finger between the pages to mark his spot. The simple action was a subtle defiance, a refusal to be rushed. "Just enjoying the weather," he replied, his voice even, devoid of challenge or fear. It was a neutral tone, almost dismissive, a stark contrast to Brutus's bluster. Brutus's sneer tightened. "Enjoying the weather? In here? You think this is a resort, softy?" He took a step closer, planting his heavy boots just inches from Alex's outstretched legs. The message was clear. Move or be moved. "You've been keeping to yourself, Shadow. That's what they call you, right? Shadow? Don't like shadows. They hide things." Alex met his gaze directly, a flicker of something unyielding in his usually placid eyes. "Some things are best kept in the dark," he said, his voice still quiet, but with an underlying steel that was imperceptible to the casual observer. He didn't flinch, didn't shrink back. The sun, now fully obscured by Brutus's bulk, left Alex's face in shadow, ironically living up to the nickname. Brutus let out a short, humorless bark of laughter. "Oh, you think you're clever, do you? Talking in riddles. I don't like clever. I like things simple. And simple is, you're new, you're small, and you're in my yard." He punctuated his words by leaning down, his face uncomfortably close to Alex's. The smell of his breath was foul, a mix of stale coffee and something else, something vaguely metallic. "So, Shadow, what are you going to do about it?" The challenge hung heavy, a gauntlet thrown. The few inmates who had dared to glance over now pretended intense interest in the scuff marks on their shoes or the distant clouds. This was a spectacle, and Brutus was the director. Alex, the unwilling actor, felt the weight of expectation. He could cower, could submit, and earn a temporary reprieve, but at the cost of his self-respect and a permanent target painted on his back. Or he could push back and face the inevitable now. His gaze, still locked with Brutus's, held no fear, only a profound, almost weary understanding. The book, a small, worn volume, lay forgotten on his lap. The sun was gone. The game had begun. The first words. The midday sun beat down, casting long, distorted shadows across the cracked concrete of the yard. The air, thick with the smell of sweat and unwashed bodies, seemed to hum with unspoken tensions. Brutus Thorn, a hulking monument of muscle and menace, loomed over Alex, his shadow eclipsing the paperback in Alex's lap. The smaller man remained still, a statue of quiet defiance amidst the yard's ceaseless churn. Brutus's voice, a guttural rasp that carried across the yard, sliced through the general din. "Hey, Tiny, what's that little book you're reading? Think you're in a library?" His words were laced with a sneer, designed to belittle, to provoke. A ripple of nervous laughter spread through the few inmates close enough to hear, their eyes darting between the two men, eager spectators to the unfolding drama. Alex, accustomed to the raw, unpolished aggression that characterized his new environment, didn't flinch. He didn't immediately respond. A deliberate pause that stretched to the silence between them taut. Slowly, with a measured grace that belied the tension of the moment, he lifted his head. His eyes, a cool, unblinking gray, met Brutus's. They held no fear, no challenge, only a quiet, almost unsettling stillness. It was the gaze of a man who saw much, but revealed little. A silent assertion of presence that caught Brutus off guard. Brutus, expecting a cower, a stammer, a frantic apology, found himself momentarily disarmed by Alex's composure. His usual tactics, honed over years of prison life, seemed to bounce off this new arrival like pebbles against a rock face. He quickly recovered, his features contorting into a wider, more menacing grin. "Lost your tongue, little man? Or are you just too scared to speak?" He leaned closer, his breath hot and stale, reeking of cheap tobacco and stale coffee. The air around them crackled with an unspoken threat. Alex's gaze remained unwavering. He didn't drop his eyes, didn't shift his weight, didn't offer so much as a flicker of emotion. It was a refusal to engage on Brutus's terms, a subtle act of rebellion that was far more potent than any outburst. The other inmates, initially amused, now watched with a growing sense of unease. This wasn't the usual show of dominance. This was something different. Brutus chuckled, a harsh, humorless sound that scraped against the quiet. "You think you're tough, huh? Sitting there like a damn monk, pretending you're not scared." He laughed louder, a booming sound that echoed off the concrete walls, attempting to project an image of absolute control. He wanted to see Alex squirm, to see the fear bloom in his eyes, to confirm his own unshakable power. But Alex offered nothing. His face was a mask of placid calm, his gray eyes reflecting the harsh sunlight without giving anything away. The silence that followed Brutus's laughter was heavy, punctured only by the distant clanging of metal and the murmur of other conversations. Alex continued to hold his gaze, his stillness a powerful counterpoint to Brutus's bluster. It wasn't defiance born of anger, but rather a deep-seated calm, a quiet resolve that seemed to radiate from him. Brutus, accustomed to immediate submission or explosive confrontation, found himself in uncharted territory. This silent resistance was more unnerving than any shouted insult. It chipped away at his carefully constructed facade of invincibility. He tried another tack, his voice dropping into a low growl, an intimate menace. "Look, new fish, this yard operates on rules. My rules. And rule number 1 is you don't ignore me." He jabbed a thick finger toward Alex's chest, stopping just short of contact. The gesture was meant to emphasize his point, to underscore the physical threat he represented. Yet Alex remained unperturbed, his chest barely rising with each quiet breath. The interaction, devoid of the expected fireworks, was becoming a slow burn. Brutus, feeling his authority subtly undermined by Alex's unresponsiveness, felt a flicker of frustration begin to ignite within him. This shadow, as some had already started to call him, was proving to be a peculiar challenge, a ghost in a world of brutes. He had anticipated a quick, decisive victory, a clear demonstration of his power. Instead, he was met with a wall of silence, a quiet strength that offered no purchase for his aggression. The first words had been spoken, but the true conversation, the one that would define their dynamic, had yet to begin. Eyes on the yard. The afternoon sun, a brazen eye in the sky, baked the concrete yard into a shimmering expanse. Brutus Thorne's usual booming pronouncements had dwindled to a guttural snarl, his features a roadmap of escalating fury. Alex, conversely, remained a tableau of serenity, his gaze unwavering, his silence a more potent counter than any shouted defiance. This burgeoning confrontation, a mere tremor moments ago, now rippled outward, seizing the yard's collective attention. Two men, hunched over a scarred wooden board, their checker pieces frozen mid-move, paused their game. Fingers poised to crown a king, now lay still on the grimy surface as their heads pivoted in unison, eyes narrowing, registering the unusual friction radiating from Brutus and the newcomer, the yard's accustomed murmur, the clink of weights, the desultory chatter. The distant thump of a basketball began to recede, replaced by an encroaching quiet. Near the faded hoop, a desultory game of basketball had been underway, the rhythmic squeak of sneakers and the slap of leather against palm providing the most consistent background noise. Now, a pass went awry, bouncing listlessly towards the fence. A man dribbling near the key allowed the ball to roll to a halt, his eyes, like those of the checker players, riveted to the brewing storm. Another, mid-shot, slowly lowered his arms, the ball still cradled, his focus completely consumed. A collective stillness descended, a shared understanding that the yard's delicate ecosystem was in flux. Old Man Jones, typically content to blend into the scenery, sat perched on his familiar, overturned bucket beneath the scant shade of a struggling tree. His leathery hands, gnarled by time, rested on a well-worn walking stick. He hadn't stirred, yet his eyes, ancient and keenly observant, missed nothing. A faint, almost imperceptible smirk touched his lips, a spark of knowing in their depths. He'd witnessed countless men come and go, 1,000 power plays unfold, but this one felt different. The kid wasn't just ignoring Brutus, he was systematically unraveling him, thread by agonizing thread, with nothing but an unnerving stillness. Slick Mike, ever the opportunist and master of the subtle read, leaned against the mess hall's peeling paint, a toothpick perpetually dancing between his teeth. He'd been attempting to peddle contraband cigarettes, but even his shrewd business instincts were momentarily eclipsed. His eyes flickered between Brutus's crimson face and Alex's impassive one. A brief flash of exhilaration, swiftly veiled, crossed his features. He savored a good spectacle, especially one where the established hierarchy seemed poised to fracture. He met the gaze of another inmate, a silent current passing between them. This is it. Something's happening. The air itself seemed to grow heavy, charged with unspoken anticipation. Every inmate, whether openly staring or subtly peeking from behind a newspaper, could feel the pressure mounting. Brutus, accustomed to instant deference, found his usual outlet denied. His bluster was meeting an impenetrable wall in the prolonged silence. Alex's unflinching gaze was transmuting his frustration into something colder, more perilous. He took a menacing stride closer, his shadow engulfing Alex's book. "You deaf, boy?" Brutus's voice was now a mere rasp, yet it carried a razor's edge of pure venom that sliced through the sudden quiet of the yard. "I asked you a question." Alex slowly, deliberately, closed his book. The soft thump it made, as he laid it on the bench, echoed in the sudden hush. He finally looked up, his eyes meeting Brutus's. There was no fear, no challenge, just an unnerving clarity. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. His steady, unyielding presence was the answer. The checker players held their breath. The basketball players stood petrified. Old Man Jones's smirk widened infinitesimally. Slick, Mike licked his lips, the toothpick forgotten. The yard was a stage, and the curtain had just risen on a drama poised to rewrite its internal script. The grab and the blur. The air hung thick and heavy, charged with an unspoken challenge. Brutus Thorne, his face a mask of escalating fury, jabbed a thick, calloused finger into Alex's shoulder. It wasn't a hard poke, more a declaration of intent, a test of the younger man's stillness. The entire yard held its breath, every eye glued to the silent tableau. Alex didn't flinch. His gaze remained level, unwavering. A mirror, reflecting none of Thorne's rage. "What's the matter, pretty boy?" Brutus sneered, his voice a low growl that carried an undercurrent of genuine malice. "Cat got your tongue? Or are you just too scared to speak?" Alex's silence was a goad, a spark in the powder keg. Brutus's eyes flickered to the worn paperback still clutched in Alex's left hand. It was a symbol, a shield of indifference that Thorne couldn't tolerate. With a sudden, explosive movement, Brutus's hand shot out, a thick, meaty claw aiming to rip the book from Alex's grasp. But Alex was no ordinary target. His body, though lean, possessed an coiled readiness that few recognized. The blur of motion was so swift, so unexpected, that it took a collective gasp from the onlookers. One moment, the book was there. The next, it wasn't. Alex's hand, a quick, almost imperceptible flick, had pulled the book back and tucked it securely against his chest. His elbow, a sudden sharp barrier. Brutus's hand closed on empty air, his momentum carrying him slightly forward, throwing him off balance for a split second. A ripple of murmurs, a mix of surprise and grudging admiration, spread through the yard. Old Man Jones, leaning against the chain-link fence, let out a low whistle. Slick Mike, always one to appreciate a good show, leaned forward, a speculative glint in his eye. They had expected a beatdown, a swift assertion of Thorne's dominance. They hadn't expected that. Brutus, his face now a mask of pure disbelief and rage, recoiled. His eyes, narrowed to slits, scanned Alex, searching for the trick, the hidden move he'd missed. Alex, meanwhile, simply adjusted his stance, his movements economical, his posture still deceptively relaxed. The book remained tucked, a silent defiance. "You think that's funny, huh?" Brutus hissed, his voice trembling with suppressed fury. His pride, the very foundation of his reign, had been publicly chipped away. He wouldn't allow it to stand. This wasn't just about a book anymore. It was about respect, about power, about the unwritten rules of this brutal place. This time, Brutus didn't telegraph his move. His entire body coiled, a massive, unthinking engine of aggression. He lunged, a full-body assault, his outstretched hand wider, aiming not just for the book, but for Alex's chest, intending to shove him back, to overpower him, to demonstrate the sheer force he commanded. It was a raw, primal move, devoid of finesse but brimming with destructive intent. But Alex was already a step ahead, no, not just reacting, but anticipating. His movement this time was even faster, a fluid shift that seemed to defy the very laws of physics. It wasn't a retreat, nor was it a direct confrontation. Instead, he spun, a controlled pivot on the balls of his feet, his body swiveling away from the charging bulk of Brutus. The book, then still held firmly, became part of the arc of his movement, disappearing from Thorn's reach as if it had simply dissolved into the air. Brutus, fueled by blind fury, overshot his mark. His momentum carried him forward, his hand once again grasping at nothing but the thin prison air. He stumbled, a clumsy, uncontrolled lurch that nearly sent him sprawling. The collective gasp, from the yard this time, was louder, tinged with an almost nervous excitement. Thorn, the undisputed king, had been made to look foolish not once but twice. The silence that followed was deafening, punctuated only by Brutus's heavy, ragged breathing. His face was blotchy, a furious red climbing up his neck. Alex, now standing a few feet from where he'd been, simply stood, the book still secured, his eyes still holding that unsettling, calm intensity. He hadn't said a word, hadn't raised a hand in aggression, yet he had delivered a potent, undeniable challenge. The yard knew it, Brutus knew it, and the game, it seemed, had just begun. The twist and the fall. The air thickened, crackling with an unspoken challenge. Brutus, his face a mask of furious disbelief, lunged again. This time, his intention was clear. Not just to snatch the book, but to shove Alex, to make him lose his footing, to publicly humiliate him. His thick arm, corded with muscle, shot out like a piston. Alex, however, didn't flinch. His previous movements had been fluid, almost accidental, in their evasion. This time, there was a deliberate shift. As Brutus's forearm neared, Alex's own arm moved, not with the brute force of a block, but with the precise, almost imperceptible speed of a blur. It wasn't a push, but a redirection. His hand met Brutus's wrist, not gripping, but deflecting, turning the larger man's momentum against him. Brutus, caught off balance by the unexpected lack of resistance and the sudden twist, stumbled forward, his heavy boots scraping on the concrete. A low growl rumbled in his chest, a sound of pure, unadulterated rage. The yard, which had momentarily hushed, now seemed to hold its breath. Even the distant clanging of metal on metal from the workshop seemed to fade. Every eye was on the two men. They had seen Thorn intimidate, seen him bully, seen him break men. But they had never seen him stumble. Not like this. Not in front of everyone. Brutus recovered quickly, his humiliation fueling a fresh surge of aggression. His face, already flushed, deepened to a dangerous crimson. He didn't bother with the book this time. His massive right fist, a blunt instrument of destruction, swung wide, aiming for Alex's head. It was a wild, desperate punch, born of frustration rather than skill, but delivered with the full weight of Brutus's considerable bulk behind it. The wind of its passage ruffled Alex's hair, but Alex was no longer there. He moved like a shadow, a whisper of motion. His head dipped, his body swiveling, a seamless, almost liquid maneuver that brought him inside Brutus's guard. The punch whistled harmlessly through the space where Alex's head had been a heartbeat before. Brutus, overcommitted, found himself facing empty air, his arm extended, his balance once again compromised. A flicker of surprise, quickly masked by renewed fury, crossed Brutus's face. He tried to pull his arm back, to reset, to deliver another crushing blow, but Alex was already moving. He didn't grab, didn't punch. Instead, his hand found Brutus's extended arm, specifically the elbow joint. It wasn't a wrenching motion, but a precise application of pressure, a subtle twist, combined with a step that shifted Alex's own weight and leveraged Brutus's extended limb. Brutus felt an unexpected pull, a sudden, irresistible force that wasn't brute strength, but something far more insidious. His own momentum, combined with Alex's precise leverage, began to work against him. He felt his body spin, a dizzying, disorienting rotation that sent him reeling. He tried to resist, to dig his heels in, but the angle was all wrong. The world blurred for a moment, with a concrete yard rushing up to meet him. Then came the impact. Brutus Thorn, the immovable force, the undisputed king of the yard, hit the ground with a sickening thud that echoed through the sudden silence. A grunt, thick with pain and humiliation, escaped his lips. As he landed hard on his side, his breath knocked out of him. The book, forgotten by both men, lay innocently on the ground near Alex's feet. Alex stood over him, still, silent, his expression unreadable. There was no triumph in his eyes, no boast, no smirk. Just a quiet, almost unsettling composure that spoke volumes. He hadn't thrown a single punch, hadn't uttered a single word. He had simply used Brutus's own aggression, his own size, and his own lack of discipline against him. The yard remained silent, stunned into immobility. The guards in the towers, usually quick to intervene in any physical altercation, seemed equally frozen, processing what they had just witnessed. Brutus, gasping for air, slowly began to push himself up, his eyes wide with a mixture of pain, confusion, and a burgeoning, terrifying respect. The hierarchy, built on years of brute force and intimidation, had just been irrevocably fractured, not by a head-on assault, but by a quiet, almost elegant defiance that had turned the very foundations of power on their head. The fall of Brutus Thorn was not just a physical one. It was a seismic shift in the prison's brutal landscape. Silence and strength. A collective gasp, thick with disbelief and a tremor of fear, rippled through the yard. It wasn't a roar, not a cheer, but a sound like a single breath catching in 100 throats. The sharp crack of Brutus Thorn's bulk hitting the concrete slab echoed, oddly muted in the sudden profound silence that followed. Dust motes danced in the anemic afternoon light, oblivious to the seismic shift that had just occurred. Alex stood over Brutus, a still, unblemished figure amidst the chaos he hadn't created, but certainly orchestrated. Not a strand of his dark hair was out of place. His prison-issue shirt, a faded gray, hung perfectly. His quiet eyes, usually downcast or scanning the periphery with detached interest, were now fixed, strong, and utterly unafraid. There was no arrogance in his posture, no triumphant smirk on his lips, only a quiet certainty, an almost weary acknowledgement of a task completed. He hadn't sought this confrontation, but he had met it, and in doing so, had unveiled a power no one had suspected. Old Man Jones, perched on his usual bench, a half-eaten sandwich forgotten in his hand, let out a slow, raspy exhalation. "Well, he murmured, his eyes wide with an unfamiliar glint of astonishment. Slick Mike, who had been leaning against a wall, casually observing the expected bloodbath, felt the smirk slide from his face. His usual quick wit failed him, leaving only a slack-jawed awe. The yard, moments before a cacophony of shouts, clanging weights, and idle chatter, was now a tableau vivant. Every inmate frozen, every gaze riveted on the fallen titan, and the silent man standing above him. Brutus, meanwhile, lay sprawled, a grotesque parody of his usual swaggering self. His heavy breathing was the loudest sound in the yard, each ragged gasp a testament to his humiliation. He blinked, his eyes unfocused, scanning the unyielding concrete as if it had betrayed him. A low groan rumbled in his chest. Slowly, with a grunt that spoke of more than just physical discomfort, he began to push himself up. His movements were clumsy, uncoordinated, a stark contrast to his earlier, aggressive lunges. He looked dazed, surprised, like a bull who had charged a phantom and found himself gored by air. His hands, thick and calloused, scrabbled against the rough ground, seeking purchase. He coughed, a dry, hacking sound, and spat a string of saliva onto the concrete. As he finally managed to prop himself up on one elbow, his eyes, still clouded with disbelief, found Alex. The rage that usually fueled Brutus was conspicuously absent, replaced by a raw, naked bewilderment. He couldn't comprehend what had just happened. He hadn't been hit. He hadn't felt a punch. Yet, he was on the ground, and the skinny new kid stood over him, looking as fresh as if he'd just finished a leisurely stroll. Alex didn't move. He didn't offer a hand, didn't gloat. He simply waited, his presence a silent, immovable force. The air crackled with unspoken questions, with the shattering of old certainties and the birth of new anxieties. The prison's established order, so rigidly maintained by brute strength and intimidation, had been upended with the effortless grace of a leaf falling from a tree. Brutus finally managed to get to his knees, swaying slightly. He wiped a hand across his bruised jaw, a purely instinctual gesture, though there was no injury to be found. His thick brows furrowed in confusion, his eyes darting from Alex to the stunned faces of his usual cronies, who now looked more like startled deer than enforcers. The silence was deafening, the weight of 1,000 unspoken thoughts pressing down. This wasn't just a fight lost. It was an empire challenged, a throne shaken. Alex's gaze remained steady, holding Brutus's with an unnerving calm. There was no challenge in it, no demand for surrender, only a quiet, undeniable statement of his own strength, a strength that lay not in muscle-bound aggression, but in an unsettling precision, a disciplined economy of motion. It was a strength that flowed from deep within, honed by something far more rigorous than street brawling. The yard still held its breath, waiting for the next move, for a shout, a new attack, anything to break the almost sacred stillness. But Alex simply held his ground, a pillar of quiet resilience. Brutus, slowly regaining his senses, felt the prickle of a new, unfamiliar fear, not of pain but of irrelevance. The hammer had been broken, not by force but by a whisper. The profound silence that blanketed the yard was not merely the absence of sound. It was the sound of an entire social order, holding its breath, waiting to see what the quiet man would do next. The prison, it seemed, was no longer Brutus Thorn's domain alone. The quiet respect! The clang of trays in the mess hall, once a prelude to Alex's daily trials, now resonated with a different cadence. No more jostling, no more artful trips. A discernible space formed around him, a silent acknowledgement of his altered status. As he navigated the crowded lanes, the usual low-level hostility simply dissolved in his wake. Hundreds of eyes tracked his movement, not with animosity, but a complex mix of curiosity and something bordering on deference. He collected his standard fare, the steam from the congealed mass doing little to whet his appetite, and settled into an open spot. The chairs immediately flanking him remained unoccupied, an invisible cordon of personal space that had been unimaginable just days prior. During yard time, the customary boisterous energy and territorial displays persisted, but Alex moved through it all with an unmolested calm. The basketball court, typically a nexus of petty disputes, seemed to hush as he passed. Huddled groups of men would subtly redirect their gazes, quickly averting their eyes when his met theirs. The air, heavy with the scent of sweat and stale concrete, no longer carried the faint, underlying tang of a predator's pursuit. One afternoon, en route to the library wing, Alex encountered Slick Mike. Mike, usually a whirlwind of hushed transactions and nervous energy, leaned against a grimy wall, feigning interest in a scuff mark. As Alex drew abreast, Mike slowly straightened, his typically evasive eyes locking with Alex's. There was no smirk, no cutting remark, just a slow, deliberate nod. It was a gesture devoid of fanfare, yet steeped in significance, a tacit recognition of power, of a new understanding. Alex simply held his gaze, offered a slight, almost imperceptible dip of his chin in return, and continued on. He heard Mike's exhale, a long, drawn-out breath, as though a burden had been lifted or a complex riddle finally solved. Old Man Jones, observing from his customary perch by the rusted fence, watched the exchange with a knowing glint in his rheumy eyes. He took a long drag from his makeshift cigarette, the acrid smoke briefly obscuring his weathered face. He moves like a shadow now, Jones murmured to himself, his words barely audible above the general din, but a shadow with teeth. Alex eventually returned to his quiet corner in the library, a personal sanctuary he'd carved out early on amidst the chaos. He retrieved his worn copy of Meditations by Marcus Aurelius, its pages dog-eared and filled with his cryptic annotations. He settled into the hard, uncomfortable chair, the familiar weight of the book, a comforting presence. The fluorescent lights hummed above, casting a sterile glow on shelves laden with forgotten stories. Yet the quiet that enveloped him now felt distinct. It wasn't merely the absence of sound, but an active, almost tangible peace, born from the respect he had inadvertently commanded. He began to read, his eyes tracing the ancient wisdom, but his mind remained acutely attuned to his surroundings. He could discern the distant shouts from the yard, the rhythmic squeak of a mop bucket from down the hall, the rustle of turning pages from a few tables over. But none of it breached his newfound tranquility. An unseen aura now surrounded him, a palpable field of deterrence. It wasn't arrogance, but a quiet strength emanating from his stillness. Even Big Bertha, on her rounds with her usual heavy-footed stride, seemed to soften her presence as she passed his table, her gaze lingering for a fraction of a second longer than usual, a flicker of something unreadable in her typically impassive eyes. The incident with Thorne had not only reshaped the yard's hierarchy, but had subtly altered the very atmosphere Alex breathed within the prison walls. The gnawing pressure was gone, replaced by a strange, almost reverent distance. He was no longer an enigma to be dissected, but a force to be acknowledged. He remained the quiet man who read his books, who kept to himself, but the silence he commanded was no longer born of vulnerability, but of undisputed power. The unspoken message was clear: leave the shadow undisturbed. And for now, everyone was content to comply. The true nature of this new equilibrium, however, remained to be seen. The calm before the next storm, perhaps, or the genesis of a deeper, more profound shift in the very fabric of their confined world.